have to switch on the microphone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear candidate, dear family members. I hereby open this academic ceremony, during which Mrs. Wendy Nuis will defend the academic thesis Guiding Student Development in Higher Education, the Role of Mentoring for Reflection and Employability Competencies. May I invite you to present, dear Mrs. Wendy Nuis, a summary of your study and the conclusion of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pro-Rector. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the members of the Assessment Committee, both here in the room as well as online. And also good morning and welcome to my family, friends, and colleagues who are present today. In the next 15 minutes, I will present to you my dissertation on guiding student development in higher education, the role of mentoring for reflection and employability competencies. In my story, I would like you to meet Lucy, who is about to graduate from her studies at Maastricht University and has to think about what she wants to do after her graduation. But to be honest, she feels quite uncertain and also ill-prepared to make that decision. And Lucy is not alone. A recent report showed that 37% of the students in higher education feel that their completed education does not provide them with the necessary knowledge and skills to perform well in their jobs. These feelings of uncertainty and ill-preparedness have two main reasons. First, many students feel overwhelmed by the many different job titles that exist that are similar for relatively similar jobs. And also, many vacancies ask for a whole list of competencies that you should already have as a student at the moment when you graduate from your education. And so the question is, what can higher education do to help these students to make an easier transition from higher education to the workplace? Well, higher education can support these students in developing their employability competencies. And so developing these employability competencies has become one of the top priorities of higher education institutes. Employability competencies are a set of competencies that help graduates to become employable, to find a job, to maintain a job, and to also switch between jobs. Examples of these competencies are, for example, social competencies, flexibility, illiteracy, and also oral and written communication skills. However, to develop these competencies, engaging in reflection is crucial. Through reflection, students recognize their learning needs, they learn from their experiences, and through reflection, they're also able to monitor their competence development. But engaging in reflection is not easy. It is not that easy to tell your students to sit down and reflect for the next 10 minutes. Instead, it requires guidance, for instance, from a teacher or a mentor. And providing structure is also important, for instance, by having students engage in various reflective tasks or reflective activities. And therefore, mentoring programs are often used to provide these guidance and this structure for students to reflect. And mentoring programs are therefore also widely known in both practice and research as an educational approach in higher education. However, not much research was yet conducted about using mentoring programs for employability development in higher education. And so, therefore, I conducted 4 studies in my dissertation to explore how mentoring can be used to support students' reflection and, in turn, also the development of their employability competencies. In the first study, I aimed at conceptualizing mentoring to get an idea of what mentoring looks like, what it is, and what the concept is about. In the second study, I wanted to develop an instrument in order to effectively measure the mentoring concept. In the third study, I wanted to research the effects of mentoring on student reflection and also on the development of their employability competencies. And in the final study, I zoomed in on the relation between mentoring and reflection to get an idea of how mentors can exactly help their students to reflect. Now, going on to the first study about conceptualizing mentoring. We noticed that in existing research on mentoring in higher education, many different and conflicting conceptualizations were used, and due to which we did not have a clear idea on what mentoring exactly entailed. Therefore, we wanted to provide more conceptual clarity by looking at the existing definitions, characteristics, and measures of mentoring. We did this by conducting a systematic literature review with a final sample of 106 studies. This resulted in the following mentoring model that consists of 5 characteristics of mentoring, being the purpose, the actor, the formalized process, the developmental relationship, and the functions and behaviors of the mentor. Furthermore, each of these 5 characteristics also include various subcomponents. For instance, if you look at the purpose, you'll see that mentoring programs can be designed for 3 different purposes: student success, competence development, or career development. Or if you look at the actor, the person who is actually the mentor, you'll see that you can have a peer student, a faculty member, or a business professional to act as a mentor. Then moving on to the second study, where we were interested in measuring mentoring. The findings of our systematic literature review revealed that existing mentoring measures were usually not validated or grounded in theory, and they also mostly focused on only 1 or 2 types of mentoring support. Therefore, we wanted to develop a questionnaire that was theoretically sound, that was based on our systematic literature review, that would be validated and also include the various types of support that we found in the literature review, so that it would capture all types of support that are important for mentoring. By performing various statistical tests, we were able to validate our questionnaire. And this led to the development of the mentoring support scale. This scale measures mentoring support across 6 types, being psychosocial support, emotional support, networking support, and also autonomy support. Also, the findings showed that this instrument was reliable across different contexts in higher education, that it was anchored in theory, and also that it now measured 6 types of mentoring support. Now that we know how to conceptualize mentoring, so what it looks like, and also how we can measure mentoring, we were of course interested in researching the effects of mentoring on reflection and the development of employability competencies. Until now, little research was conducted about using mentoring programs for these purposes, so for employability development. And so the third study looked at the direct relationship between mentoring and employability competencies, and we were also interested in exploring the role of reflection as a potential mediator, because there was no research on this variable as well. A questionnaire was used to collect data from students who were part of a mentoring program, and we asked them to fill in a questionnaire before the start of the mentoring program and also at the end of the mentoring program. And we conducted a path analysis to study the different relationships of our research model. The findings of this study showed that mentoring indeed helps students to develop their employability competencies, and that especially autonomy support and empathy were found to have a significant effect. The findings also show that mentoring indeed helps students to reflect, and that especially perceived similarity between the mentor and the mentees, for instance in shared interests, values, or experiences, had a significant relationship. And lastly, we found that reflection is indeed a key driver for developing students' employability competencies. In the fourth study, we wanted to zoom in on the role of mentoring for reflection. So what can mentors exactly do to help their students reflect? In existing research, this was still a gap, because there were many articles and also one review study that highlighted that we still didn't know much for educational practitioners how we can actually help them or help our students to engage in reflection. And therefore, in this final study, we wanted to uncover what types of mentoring support induce student reflection, and also then what the depth and content of their reflection is. To investigate this, we conducted 13 semi-structured interviews with students who were part of a mentoring program. The results showed that 3 types of mentor support are most important for helping students to reflect, which are autonomy support, empathy, and trust and availability. And furthermore, we were able to identify specific behaviors of the mentor for each of these support types. For instance, if you look at autonomy support, I now listed 2 examples. Mentors could support their students by helping them setting goals or by providing feedback, for instance, on these goals, because feedback that you receive as a student can help you to think about this and see, okay, how does that help me to further develop? When looking at the content of students' reflection, we found that students reflect on 3 different topics, 3 clusters, which are non-cognitive content, cognitive content, and affective content. Within these bigger clusters, we were able to distinguish between more specific contents of reflection. For instance, for non-cognitive content, students reflected about their future job, or for example, about their learning goals. Moreover, the results also showed that students reflected about affective content, but only for half of the group. So a little bit more than 50% reflected about affective content, while all students reflected on non-cognitive and cognitive. So this was an interesting finding as well. So taking this together, what did we now learn about mentoring for reflection and employability competencies? When looking at our research model, going back to the first study, we were interested in conceptualizing mentoring. How did it now look like? And we were able to develop a mentoring model, including those 5 characteristics. In the second study, we wanted to measure mentoring, and we succeeded in developing a validated and reliable mentoring support skill. In the third study, we were curious about the effects of mentoring. And we learned that mentoring can indeed be an effective educational approach to help students reflect and in turn develop their employability competencies. And in the final study, we wanted to learn more about mentoring behaviors, and we were able to identify which support types and which concrete behaviors for each of the support types are useful for students to help them engage in reflection. These findings also translate into practical advices. For example, for mentoring program coordinators, so the people who are responsible for creating and designing mentoring programs in higher education. As such, I would recommend program coordinators to use the 5 characteristics when designing their mentoring program. For instance, by thinking, okay, for which purpose do I actually want to design my mentoring program? And if I have this purpose in mind, who would be most suitable to fulfill this mentoring role, thereby going to the actor? And so the 5 characteristics can be used as design principles. I would also recommend organizing mentor training, because based on the findings, we now know which behaviors and support types are most useful for mentors. And this is something that mentor training can help the mentors with. So if you organize a mentoring program, please keep in mind to also train your mentors on this. I would also like to facilitate regular check-ins, so that mentors can learn from each other and share experiences about their mentoring practice. And program coordinators could also consider matching. Based on the findings, we learned that perceived similarity between mentor and mentee might actually help students to reflect on a deeper level. And so, at least considering the effect of matching mentor and mentee, for example, on shared interests, might be something to consider. And lastly, program coordinators could use our mentoring support skill to evaluate their mentoring program. They can use this to see, okay, how well do my mentors provide each type of support, or how does my mentoring program affect, for example, my students' reflection or employability. We also have a few practical advices for mentors. First, we would like mentors to provide autonomy support and focus on empathy and relationship building, because those were found to be important for developing students' employability. Mentors should also capitalize on shared similarities, such as shared interests, values, and experiences. It's important to find common ground between the mentor and the mentee, because that might be a necessary foundation to start the relationship and to focus on relationship building. Mentors should also take time to create a psychologically safe environment in which mentees feel safe to share their concerns or to talk about their personal development. And lastly, when trying to stimulate student reflection, mentors should pay explicit attention also to the component of effective reflection, because this was found that not all students engage in effective reflection by themselves, while it is found to be important. And so mentors may have a role in stimulating this type of reflection. Taking these findings and practical implications to heart, we hope that higher education institutes, such as Maastricht University, will implement mentoring programs to make sure that Lucy no longer feels uncertain and ill-prepared about her future, but that she feels confident and also well-prepared and faces a bright future. Thank you for your attention, and I would now like to give the word back to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Nuis, for your presentation. It'll sound familiar to you, and you know that reflection cannot be forced, and that only the right conditions can be created in which reflection is likely to occur. As part of the game, we do enforce upon you an opposition. We do so with much affection. Nevertheless, the opposition will be opened by the chair of the assessment committee, Professor Dr. Wim Gijselaars.
Dear candidate, first of all, I would really like to congratulate you with the quality of the work we're discussing today. And I have to say it was a real pleasure reading your PhD thesis, and I was deeply impressed by how you took care of the many details in your studies, because it's not an easy subject we're discussing. I also noticed that after the defense, we're going to Lumiere, and we're having a reception over there, and I invite all of you, once you're there, start searching for a poster with a quote which has been attributed to Quentin Tarantino. And the quote says, "When people ask me if I went to film school, I tell them, no, I went to films." And if you may wonder, who is Quentin Tarantino? Well, it seems he has directed the movies Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill Volume 1 and Kill Bill Volume 2. And he won awards for it. So I started wondering, where's the connection between the quote on the poster and your research? And the key for it seems to lie in the way we prepare graduates for practice. And you're saying higher education plays a very important role in this. And one of the things you're trying to do is you're trying to help our graduates in developing a more critical reflection on their work so that they can learn and adapt. Mm-hmm. Now, there's one person who seems that person didn't need it, and that's Quentin Tarantino. He just started making movies from the beginning. But when I was reading your thesis, I thought when you look at chapter 4, your study 3, there's a model in it. And in that model, you try to understand what the intervention effect is of the mentoring program, how this relates to critical reflection, how critical reflection relates to employability competencies. So my question is this. You're measuring it with a survey, and you do this at T1 and T2.
Yeah.
And the connection between T1 and T2 for employability is quite strong. And however, the predictors on employability competences at T1 and T2 from critical reflection are quite low. Mm-hmm. So I started wondering, given the importance you're attaching to this whole idea of there must be something like critical reflection, I thought, couldn't it be that the instrument is quite valid and stable, mm-hmm. but maybe it's not measuring critical reflection or only a part of what you want to capture? And if that would be the case, then would it be an idea that if you start trying to measure in another study in the future, where it's either through stimulated recall or interviews, so in a more qualitative way like you're doing in the chapter 5, to capture this whole idea of critical reflection. So basically my question is, did you really measure critical reflection, or what the model says is just a consequence of the measures you're using?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you first of all for your compliments about my work and also for your interesting question, mainly about critical reflection and how we use that and measure that in our third study. I would like to start my answer by explaining that indeed measuring critical reflection in a questionnaire, in a self-report questionnaire, might have a few flaws, but I also believe that this was, for this study, the best way to measure a post-test, pre-test design by using a questionnaire. And by going into more detail, I think that measuring critical reflection in a questionnaire we might have a difficulty there, because indeed what you mentioned is that students might have difficulties assessing their own level of reflection. They might overestimate, for example, and think they are great reflectors and fill in the questionnaire that way, or they might underestimate maybe, could also be. So the self-report questionnaire on reflection might be a difficulty. On the other hand, I think that by using this in a pre-test, post-test design, the students that might, for example, be overestimators would probably be that in the T1, so before they start the mentoring program. Afterwards, when they went through the mentoring program, maybe their self-assessment of their reflection becomes more accurate. I think the same would hold for the other group of students who might start underestimating their reflective abilities and actually learn through engaging in mentoring and in the reflective task that, oh, maybe I am a good reflector, or at least now I have the tools to engage in reflection a bit more or a bit deeper. And I think that is something that I would be interested in exploring in future research. And what you mentioned in study 4 with the interviews, it is something that we did not touch upon yet, because we were interested in finding out the support types to help students reflect in the first place. But looking at how reflection can actually be measured, given that it's also such a cognitive concept, right? It's difficult to grasp, both for students as for teachers or mentors. I think that would be interesting for future research to do. And I would agree that maybe in a questionnaire that would not make most sense, given that it is a self-report measure. But I would advocate for a follow-up study, for example, by using interviews and then not highlighting which support types would help students, but really digging deeper into that critical reflection and see, okay, when did they reflect? How did that reflection look like? And then maybe also adding another perspective from the mentor or the evaluator and trying to see if you can make that a little bit more objective. So that would be my idea for a future study. And I would also say maybe I would also include different methods to see if you can make data triangulation and say, okay, maybe if we add the portfolios. In a lot of mentoring programs, students write a portfolio, for example, in which we as educators hope to see or evaluate their reflection level. That might also be an idea to include that in future studies.
Okay.
I hope this answers your question.
This answers my question. Okay. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you very much. Undoubtedly, we will dive deeper and deeper into the matter you bring forward. The opposition will be continued by Professor Piet van den Bosse, Maastricht University and Antwerp University. Piet.
Thank you, Chairman. Dear candidate, I also want to congratulate you with this work. You should kind of go through the chapters. It's a rich portfolio of research. You start off with conceptual work, you do systematic review, you develop a questionnaire, then you do empirical studies, and you do quantitative, qualitative, so it's all there. And I was even more surprised when I found the booklet in my desk. You do not only find a PhD manuscript, you also find a second book, in which you translate everything for practice. So I think it shows how deep you went into it, but also how you are combining this theoretical and practical work. So my congratulations for that. So I was looking forward to have this discussion today. And indeed, we go a little bit deeper, and I want to kind of connect to the Chapter 4 discussion on another thing, in which you have this pre- and post-test design, and you write yourself. We have used questionnaires before and after participation in 4 similar one-year mentoring programs. And I want to go into that because first I was surprised because I was interested what is similar, and then you describe that as they all are individual programs and they are focused on employability. And then I was looking for those other characteristics. You have this nice conceptual model, and I was not finding it back in your description of those mentoring programs. So you maybe can touch upon that, but it leads a little bit to my first question, because you use those questionnaires for those mentors, which are filled in by those mentees. And I was thinking, what are you measuring? Is it one, what is happening in the relationship between the mentor and the mentee? Or is it maybe also, or is it 2, is it the mentor and how he conducts his mentorship? Or is it 3, the effects of a mentor program? So is it 1, 2, or 3 we're measuring?
Highly esteemed opponent, also thank you for your compliments about my work, and I'm glad that you enjoyed reading it as well. You have a very interesting question here.
Thank you.
And I would like to try and give you an answer to that. I think indeed that the 3 avenues that you proposed for my study 3 about what did we measure, the relation between the mentor and mentee, the practice, the behavior of the mentor, the support that he provides, or the effects of the program, of the mentoring practice as such. That's an interesting question. What I believe we try to capture here is mainly the support types of the mentor. So the second element that you mentioned. Also connecting it to the model that you referred to in the first part of your question. I believe that the mentoring practice or the mentoring program as such is not something that we try to measure in this study. Given if you look at the mentoring model, for example, the support types of the mentor is one element. It's one of the 5 characteristics. For example, the purpose that the program coordinators have in mind, or the formalized process, so how many or how often do the mentor and mentee meet, do the mentors have training, those programmatic components were not part of the questionnaire, and therefore I believe we did not measure the mentoring program or the effects of the mentoring program.
And could it have influenced your data, the fact that...
If we would have measured.
No, but now, even now, because you didn't describe it, but probably one mentor had different mentees.
Yeah.
So you have, and then you have 4 mentoring programs. Could it not be, or is it not the case even, that there is some nestedness in your data? Because every relationship is, this mentor is part, so if I'm filling in a questionnaire, there are different mentees that having the same mentor, probably there is some effect of that, and those mentors are, of course, part of a program which also influences their behavior and their possibilities and part of an institution. So could it be that your focus could also be intermingled a little bit, or not? If we draw out the effects of the mentor program and of the mentee, that we maybe have more clear understanding of what is happening.
Yes, I think that if you would control even more for similarities in the mentoring programs, you could rule out the risk of the mentoring program having an additional effect, for example, on reflection or employability. But I think by looking at the mentoring programs that we have in our sample, and by optimizing or by selecting these mentoring programs and making sure that they have at least the main characteristics being similar, I think we tried to our best extent to make sure that it was not the program aspects that have a main effect, but actually the support of the mentor.
Okay.
I think
I believe you. I believe you. Do you have time for a second question?
if it's a brief one.
That's going to be hard. Now, maybe because you say in the results of the chapter, you say that trust doesn't have an effect, even maybe a negative effect. I just want to have your reflection on that, because I was surprised, as you were, as if I read your manuscript. If I look into the correlation table on page 122, and I look there, you have a positive effect. So there is a positive effect that seemed to disappear in your analysis. And if I, on the other hand, an observation I had that trust had very high bivariate correlations with those other aspects of the trust. Could it be that because you're in your explanation, you're looking for this, explaining this negative effect, could it also be that it's an artifact of the fact of putting all these variables together into your model?
Yes, I think it might be, because if we go back to the second study, for instance, when we developed the questionnaire, the trust and availability was part of the psychosocial support type. So when we started developing that instrument, we basically had one group, psychosocial support, that included many elements. And then in the validation process, it turned out that the construct dissolved basically into 3 subgroups, of which trust and availability is one. That might hint at that if you use that as a separate concept or separate construct in your questionnaire for study 3, and you look at the preliminary analysis, so the correlation, etc., it might actually be a reason that it's difficult to capture that as a standalone concept for students, and that by explaining it in a negative relationship in a discussion is trying to explain why students viewed it as a negative relationship in the more theoretical way. But looking at it from a methodological perspective, this might be actually also an answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I would love to discuss this further, but my time is limited. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Others will take over that role. You're not out of the woods yet,
No.
Mrs. Nuis. I'll give the floor to Professor Dr. Annick de Bruin of Maastricht University. The floor is yours, Annick.
Thank you, Chairman. Dear candidate, I would also very much like to congratulate you with this very thorough and decent piece of work. I applaud the diversity in the methodology you use. The topic is extremely important. Every single student in higher education has to deal with this. How can we support them as teachers for them to become more employable? So I really commend you for doing such an important work in such a thorough manner. I'd like to also exchange some thoughts, of course. And I'm not letting go of chapter 4 and 5 and the topic of critical reflection yet. We've talked about it before, but I'd like to dive more into it. And I know you cite a piece of work by Lacroix and Vane as well, in which they describe the reflective zombie. Now, you may remember, I'm going to summarize it quickly for those who don't know it. They describe 2 students, and these students are similar in backgrounds. Same age, same IQ, same sort of socioeconomic status. They do a reflection assignment, they are graded on it, and they get the exact same grade. And it turns out that one of them has engaged really in reflection, and the other one just gamed the system.
Yeah.
They reflected on paper, but they did not inherently reflect at all. It's not representing what they are feeling and doing. And this is, of course, a big issue, because reflection, the topic of reflection it's almost become like a holy grail, I would say, in higher education. If we can get students to reflect, then all these really positive things will happen. But we also know that once we know the validity of the content of the reflection, it turns out they're really poor at it. They overestimate, as you say. They sometimes underestimate. So if we have the basis to which we can really check the quality of the reflections, it turns out to be difficult. And in the context that you described, the mentoring context, it's really hard to do so. We don't have the standards, and I'm a mentor myself in different ways. I really have to trust the student. There's this trust relationship from the teacher to the student as well. I don't know what exactly going on with the student. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this issue of the validity of the content of the reflection? I don't think your data yet show any relation to actually assessing that quality. And the suggestions you just gave on triangulation, I don't think they solve this issue. Do you agree with me that this is really a problem? And do you have any ideas on what to do about that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you as well for your compliments about my work, and also for extending the discussion on the topic of critical reflection. I indeed know the article you're referring to about the reflective zombie, and being a mentor myself as well, I know the struggles as an educator to make sure that your students actually engage in reflection and do not write reflective in their portfolio for the sake of reflection. So the first question you asked, do you agree? Yes, I agree that that is a very hard struggle. It's a difficulty that we need to tackle in mentoring programs or in educational approaches targeted at fostering student reflection. So yes, I think that is something that we should be very well aware of. On the other hand, I do not believe it's something that we just then should not pay attention to and don't do something about. I believe that, for example, by data triangulation, we can at least overcome parts of it. We, not for this dissertation, but we also coded, for example, reflective work in the portfolios. And we used the same Gamber questionnaire basically with the students. When we compared those two, you'll, for example, see that you have a group of overestimators. Well, if you assess their written work, it's less reflective than how they evaluated themselves. But still, you don't know if they then engaged in reflection, yes or no. So in that sense, the methodology might somewhat help, but not to the full extent. I think what my approach would be is that, at least from my personal experience, and to be honest, I'm not sure yet if that's backed up by literature, so I would love to research that further. I think you'll sometimes, or hopefully most of the time, see the reflection happening in the meeting with the student. I think there is where you'll see, okay, they have a new insight of, oh, okay, so that is how I can connect my learning experience to what was happening to me now, for example. And I think if you would be able to capture those moments, you'll actually be able to research that reflection that is happening on the spot. So the reflection in action during the meetings, I think that might actually be interesting, because that is where you as a mentor or an educator can influence, right? You're able to ask an additional question, you're able to try and shift perspectives, and that is something that you can actually try and establish in that meeting. I think by having students write a portfolio at home on a task they did does not necessarily guarantee that they actually engage in reflection.
Do I have time, or is it time's up?
Briefly.
Okay, really briefly.
Yeah.
Do you agree with me that the term reflection is just way too big? If I hear you talk about, how students interact with mentors, there's so many facets to it. So the student can have the learning experience and really have an aha moment, and that might be a valid reflection, but the topic of that whole learning experience may not be valid. So those are two separate things. Shouldn't we make it much smaller and use more specific theories on self-monitoring, for example, and have students practice with, just trying to at a smaller scale, at a lower level granularity, figure out what it is they're working on and how they're doing?
I think that would be a very good idea. Also because I believe that the topic of reflection, or the concept of reflection in research, is also very difficult to grasp. There are many different definitions, there are many different frameworks, for example, Schoen or Kolb, or everyone looks at it slightly different or makes its own model, basically. And I think by really going to the core, or maybe even disentangling specific parts of what we now see as reflection, would actually make sense in education as well as in research.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's getting hotter and hotter, and it will bring you to a place of 35 degrees at Swinburne University of Technology in Australia by giving the floor to Professor Dr. Eva Kind. The floor is yours, dear colleague.
Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt your... Yeah.
We don't hear you. I'm looking for technical assistance. Try once more, Eva.
What about now? Yes. I am unmuted, so...
Go on, it works. It seems to work. Go.
Yep. Okay, perfect. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yes, I can concur. It's very warm here, but I can also concur with all the compliments of my colleagues. I think your dissertation exemplifies what a well-versed researcher you are. It shows your writing skills, and as colleague Van den Bossen has also pointed out, the application to what it means in practice is definitely one of the strengths that we don't see often in PhD dissertations. Of course, I'm also here to ask you a couple of questions and hopefully give you an opportunity to show your mastery even further. You will probably be relieved to know that I won't be asking you questions about chapter 4, but I want to take a look at your conceptual chapter and also your conceptual understanding of dissertation as a whole. So having worked myself in both education faculties, organizational psychology, and now in a business school at a technological university just slightly obsessed with space and astrophysics, I know very well that bias creeps into disciplines, and certain assumptions take their roots into the literature, and they're very difficult to get rid of. So I want to challenge you to look at the theory where it stands now as a newly minted researcher in this field, and challenge it to go beyond. What are some of those dominant assumptions that you see, and what would you recommend to your fellow researchers to kind of break through that? That's part one, more conceptual for researchers. But on the practice side as well, we see a lot of very dominant patterns, mentors sticking to their habits, organizations sticking to their habits. So also on the practice side, what are dominant patterns that you see, and how would you break through them?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your nice words and your compliments about my work and my dissertation. And I'm happy to answer both of your questions, actually. The one more research-oriented and the one more practice-oriented. Let's start with the practice-oriented question, the last one you asked, because I think something popped up in my mind immediately. That's why I wanted to start with that one. Because being a mentor myself, but also reading the literature, it seems to be an educational approach that many higher education institutes, so on the policy and board level, have difficulties implementing it because they believe it's not time efficient, it's very costly. You need to train your mentors, what we also advocate in my dissertation, in a different way than in the more traditional teacher behavior that they're used to as a teacher. So I think those are the habits, or maybe they're not even habits, but the beliefs that educators or policy developers have about how we should design education. And I think that something that we would emphasize is that, yes, mentoring programs as such are actually scalable. We can implement those in large bachelor programs, for example, at Maastricht University. Or we can implement those in programs with distance education or with adult education. So we researched this with samples that are very similar. So one-on-one mentoring, physically present mentor and mentee with the goal of employability development. But I believe that the foundations we lay in this dissertation are actually also applicable to other types of mentoring programs. And I think that habit of saying, no, it's not efficient enough, it's too costly, or we cannot do this with large student intakes, there I would disagree. And I think there are certainly ways that we can use our insights to use mentoring also in practice in different types or different setups of mentoring programs. Does this answer your question about the practical part?
Yeah. Definitely. It's going to be a tough sell at my university, but I will try.
With that. Then going on to the more theoretical question. So how do we now view mentoring? How do we view the concept? Also linking it to existing theories or assumptions about how we view learning. And I think that it is something that it ties nicely into existing learning theories. In my systematic literature review, we slightly touched upon, for example, transformative learning theory. And I think that mentoring, the way we now conceptualized it, is a nice translation of those maybe more intangible learning theories to making it a more tangible educational tool or educational approach and how you can actually use it. So I think that the learning theories I touched upon and that are existing in higher education research are still valid and important to take into account. But I think that, for example, the student-centered part, making sure that students are the agents of their learning process, making sure that they learn collaboratively, all of those underlying educational principles, I think mentoring in the way we now used it is a very nice way to translate those more abstract theoretical underpinnings to an educational innovation, educational tool that you can actually use in the classroom. And I think that is how I would look at what we did in the conceptual study. We looked at all articles on mentoring and how they defined it, how they operationalized it, because we noticed that many education programs do somehow use a mentoring program. We try to see what are the similarities here and what can then be building blocks, actually, to design them in a way that it still links to the educational literature, but use it in a more practice-oriented way. I hope this answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Tools, instruments, mentoring programs, this automatically brings us to the opposition by Dr. Maaike Enderdijk, Professional Learning and Technology of Universiteit of Twente.
Thank you, and dear candidate, I would like also to compliment you with your work. Especially, I value a lot that it's very balanced. It has different methodologies, but also quite different outcomes, sometimes even different than we expected. So it was a very interesting read. And I'm also very happy with your answer to Professor Eva Kienz, because it provides a nice basis to continue on for me. Because we live in a world of change, and challenges are not easily solvable. So we need professionals in the future that both can continuously develop themselves, but also are able to change perspectives and maybe leave their initial ideas at a certain stage and continue in a different way, develop their identity, etc. So reflection on who they are and want to become as a professional when they're students is quite crucial and contributes to their employability. At least that's what you're claiming. And your thesis claims that this can be supported by the mentoring program. And specifically, you developed an instrument that can be used to evaluate these programs. But I'm not fully convinced about that. That's my task also for today. So I miss a distinction between evaluation of mentoring practices and a mentoring program. I'm a mentor myself, young assistant professors, and if I look at your instrument, I hope that I'm ticking all the boxes, but it's absolutely not a program. I'm not really structuring, building up something or changing over time my behavior so that it become more independent, etc. So for me, a program is more than a practice and should contain more structure. And I think your question is not touching upon that yet. And second, I'm also questioning if your instrument is then future-proof for this disruptive futures that we have to prepare our students for. The skills you included seem to focus a lot on a mentor that is comforting you, is highly similar to you, gives you compliments, maybe it's like a friend, see, for example, the similarity items. But is that what we need? Is that what prepares them for the future? So I'm missing your instrument that the mentoring is sometimes also uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Maybe providing disorienting dilemmas. You touched upon the transformative learning. So in other words, do you agree that your instrument does not fulfill the requirements to evaluate a program in even more not a future-proof contemporary program? And if you agree, what would you add to your instrument to do that? What kind of skills, what theoretical grounding, and also what target groups would you use then to validate the instrument? Because I think people that do like a hotel school and are only there to please people, is maybe they're not the best target group.
Okay, highly esteemed opponent. Also, thank you very much for your compliments and for your interesting questions. There are actually quite a few, so I'll try to answer all of them. Starting with the instrument and the program versus practice question, actually.
Yeah.
I think that with the instrument, taking one slight step back to the literature review, we found many more programmatic aspects of a mentoring program that indeed hopefully build up. So if you have a mentoring program in the year, there is a logical, chronological order of tasks or of activities. What we noticed in our systematic literature review, but also in the ones that we build upon, is that the support function of the mentor was actually found to be most important. So you basically set the stage with the conditions and the boundaries in your mentoring program, but that is designed by the coordinators. The most important role, I think you would agree, is with the mentor.
Yeah, but you say was, because these are built on previous studies and older, 15, 20 years ago, but now for the future.
Yeah. So I would still say that the most important role is for the mentor, and that is providing the support or certain behaviors. That is something that we would argue is not necessarily building up in a way. I would say it's shifting perspectives. Maybe in the beginning of the year, if you take a yearly mentoring program, the mentor provides more autonomy support, and maybe towards the end of the year, more networking support when students hopefully are entering the labor market. So I think it's not necessarily building up in a programmatic way. I think it's more the mentoring practice, the way you practice your mentoring as a mentor, is that where you are able to change or shift perspectives based on the types of support that are identified. And I think that is what we tried capturing with the instrument as well. So it zooms in on those different types of support and seeing, okay, maybe is there a blind spot? Maybe do I not provide networking support at all? Not in the beginning, but also not towards the end. And I think that is something that we tried capturing with the instrument. And I think that is also future-proof. I would say that going back to, or moving on to your second question of, okay, those support types are then maybe too comforting, or maybe it's a softer approach. There I would say yes and no. Yes, in a way of the behavior, especially in the beginning. That psychosocial support, for example, is maybe a comforting, a trust-based approach. I think that is the key towards relationship building. I think without that part, you cannot challenge your mentee.
Agree.
Right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think that it is future-proof, and that it is not in that direct behavior, the softer part, that we need to change. I think it's in the tasks or in the assignments or in the thoughts that we hope the students have, where we challenge them, where we try for them to step out of their comfort zone. But I think by establishing that first safe zone is where actually you can grow. I think it's where we also talk about that zone of that learning environment. It's where you do not want to push them out of their comfort zone too much, where they freak out and panic and don't develop themselves. It's where you can push them based on that relationship that you've built in the beginning.
Do I understand your answer correctly, that you would not add a scale, for example, on my mentor is challenging my ideas or is providing different perspectives, etc.? Because that is what I'm missing.
Yes.
So I agree, trust in the beginning, but something...
But afterwards?
Yeah. I would expect something else as well.
Yeah. I think it's a valid point. And I would also, connecting it to existing literature, also what we found in the literature review in the small details, it's something that we also came across. So yes, I think that is mentor behavior that we should include in mentoring programs. We could potentially also include it as a scale in the instrument. We actually discussed about this, but it was hard to capture this in a overarching support type. It would then be challenging the mentee or pushing them out of the comfort zone. So I think it's hard to capture that as a theoretical concept. It's in the smaller behaviors, but I'm not sure if we would include that as one of the support types in this scale.
I see the prorector moving a bit, so I think my time is up.
Thank you very much for the discussion. It's tough, but we're here to do the hard things. Yeah, no?
Yeah.
You agree? Then let me continue the opposition by giving the floor to Dr. Annemarie Kuhn.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I also would like to congratulate you with your work. It was really nice to read, and it also learned me a lot as not being one of the field. So you can also expect a different type of question from me. But I also want to say that I really liked the thesis as a whole. You really have a full worked out thesis with a new model, a measurement model as well as a theoretical model, and you also apply and test this, which was really nice to see. My question is about the focus of your thesis on higher education. As an educator myself at this university, I know that there is a real need for research on this topic, but I also think that it would be very valuable in other educational levels. So if we would think about the vocational educational programs, for example, I think there is a high need for research about this, the role of mentoring and reflection as well. You write down in your introduction that it's very important in this changing labor market that people are able to reflect, to adapt to the challenges that they face. And I think especially people with a vocational educational background, they are educated for a very specific occupation. If this occupation is changing or maybe even disappearing due to automation or other technologies, then those people need to be very adaptive and reflective as well. And preferably they see this a bit ahead, see this coming and change. Also, you mentioned that it's important that we already think about developing these competencies in education, because the later on you try to teach people these type of skills, the harder it gets. And that is especially also the case for people with vocational education. They are way more difficult to move towards lifelong learning activities. So for them, it would be especially very valuable to have these competencies developed during education. So first of all, the question is why the focus on higher education? And do you agree that it might be very valuable for the more vocational educational programs as well? The second question is related and is about what your expectations would be. Do you think that the model that you develop, both the theoretical as well as the measurement model, would also fit in this context? Especially given in one of your chapters you find already differences between people from applied universities and research universities. So how do you think that an extension towards vocational education would change the way to look at the matter? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your compliments and for your questions. And I like the fact that we're now taking a different perspective. The question one, why higher education? I would like to start with that one. I think, I believe that we chose for higher education as a context or a setting for this dissertation is that we noticed that because of the fact that students are more unsure of their jobs afterwards, it was a very interesting target group to research. And I think what you mentioned before, so vocational education, for example, where you are maybe trained to become a hairdresser, at least that question is it's still relevant, but maybe slightly less relevant. While if you ask a student who is in international business what they would like to do afterwards, there are so many different occupations that they sometimes don't even know where to start looking for jobs. I think that's one or maybe even the main reason why we decided to stay within the context of higher education, because there the struggle for where to start and how to become such a...
Thank you very much. You've got a couple of minutes. 1 or 2 minutes. Go on, please.
Okay. I'll finish my answer. I think that is one of the most interesting or main reasons why we decided to focus on higher education, because that is one of the more explicit struggles that the students have in my target group. Slightly a short answer to the second question, because I think that's an interesting one as well. Would the model still hold or would it fit? I think, yes, the main components would, especially if you go back to that support types. I think that is also very important for maybe students in vocational education. I think the employability competencies are also valid for them or important for them. For example, the lifelong learning is also something that is underlying for vocational education students. So I think in essence, the main concepts would not change and the mentoring model would still hold. But I think the way we implement it in vocational education might actually have a different outcome. And that is something to change. Keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Wendy Nuis, the time appointed for defending your thesis has unfortunately passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense, leaving you ample opportunity to reflect on your today's performance. I request that you do so and your company. Please await the results of our deliberations here in this room. Thank you very much.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Maar goed, ik ga mijn best doen. Volgens mij mag je zitten, of niet? Nee, weet ik ook niet.
Mrs. Wendy Nuis, the degree committee here present has reflected upon your work, has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Bozard Simon is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please.
Belooft u dat u altijd volgens de beginselen van wetenschappelijke integriteit te werk zult gaan, eerlijk en zorgvuldig, transparant, onafhankelijk en verantwoordelijk?
Dat beloof ik.
Krachtens de bevoegdheid ons door de wet toegekend volgens het besluit van de commissie hier tegenwoordig, verklaar ik u hierbij, Wendy Nuis, tot dokter te bevorderen en u alle rechten te verlenen die daaraan volgens wet en gewoonte zijn verbonden. Ten bewijze hiervan overhandig ik u nu de bul, door rector, secretaris en overige leden van de promotiecommissie ondertekend en met het grootzegel van de universiteit bevestigd. Gaan we nu over tot het iets minder formele gedeelte. Beste dokter Nuis, beste Wendy. Met veel plezier feliciteer ik je, mede namens de commissie, met het behalen van je PhD-graad aan de Universiteit van Maastricht. Ik weet zeker dat je ERD-collega's van de School of Business and Economics en je familie en vrienden hier talrijk aanwezig net zo trots zijn als wij dat je je PhD-project hebt afgerond. Je proefschrift en het traject dat je hebt gevolgd zijn beide in vele opzichten buitengewoon. Laat me je wat meer vertellen over beide. Enerzijds over de uitstekende kwaliteit van je proefschrift, anderzijds over het unieke pad dat je hebt gevolgd, het pad dat je hier vandaag heeft gebracht. Langs dat pad leerden we verschillende smaken van Wendy kennen. En gezien je hotelmanagement roots besloot ik deze verschillende smaken te introduceren door het sterrenmenu van vandaag door te nemen. Ik kan je nu al vertellen dat je versteld zult staan, publiek, van alle smaken die Wendy als sterrenchef weet te combineren. We starten met het voorgerecht, Wendy. Wendy, we hebben elkaar leren kennen in het academisch jaar 16-17. Dat jaar studeerde je samen met partner in crime Samantha Krans de Master Learning and Development in Organizations. Je passie voor mensen kwam meteen naar boven, net als je hotelmanagement roots en je talent voor het organiseren van social events. Als lid van het organiserende studentencomité organiseerde je als geen ander Sinterklaasfeestjes en diners, een traditie die je ook tijdens het werken bij ERD later zou doortrekken. Je was jaren de karttrekker van het verjaardagsfeestcomité en je was een kei in het bedenken van attente gebaren en cadeautjes. Het wordt al meteen bevestigd. Je organisatietalent werd zo erg gewaardeerd door je collega's dat je tot 3 keer toe als paranimf werd gevraagd. Nu, je interesse in onderzoek daarentegen werd gewekt toen je aan je masterscriptie werkte. Over teameffectiviteit in de context van emergency management command and control teams, een ganse mond vol. En toen je kort daarna werd aangenomen als onderzoeksassistent. Tijdens dat jaar richt je je op het Bachelor Learning Experience project, het in kaart brengen van de leerervaringen van onze studenten International Business, een belangrijk project waarop ook de reorganisatie van het curriculum zou worden gebaseerd. Het project liet ook meteen je hart voor onderwijs zien, want wie had kunnen voorspellen dat je een paar jaar later bachelor- en mastercursussen over leren en ontwikkelen zou geven en dat je een doctoraat zou gaan verdedigen over het begeleiden van studenten in het hoger onderwijs. Bon, na dit voorgerecht, Wendy, met een vleugje onderwijs, organisatietalent en onderzoek, denk ik dat we met z'n allen klaar zijn voor het hoofdgerecht. Want in september 18 werd het officiële startsein gegeven voor een mooi promotietraject. Je was klaar voor nog meer onderwijs, meer onderzoek en nog meer onderzoeksvoorstellen. Alsof 1 promotieonderzoek niet voldoende was, besloot Wendy een Comeniusbeurs aan te vragen, die ze dan ook nog eens kreeg toegekend en die ze tegelijkertijd met het PhD-traject uitvoerde. En dan denk je, 2 projecten hevig, maar alsof 2 projecten nog niet genoeg waren, vroeg Wendy 2 jaar later nog een NRO-beurs aan ook. Die werd opnieuw toegekend en die ging je opnieuw combineren met je PhD-traject. En ja, er is nog meer. Er werd al door Piet naar verwezen. Maar ook tijdens je PhD-project besliste je om samen met die andere partner in crime, Niels van der Baan, een boek te schrijven over mentoring in het hoger onderwijs, getiteld Coaching op de grens tussen onderwijs en werk. Samen met Johan de Wilde van Hogeschool Odyssee maakten Wendy en Niels op deze manier een proefschrift toegankelijk voor een breed publiek, vastberaden hun onderzoeksresultaten te vertalen in praktische tips en tricks voor de mentor of coach in de praktijk. En als je dan denkt, dat moet toch de kwaliteit van dat proefschrift aangetast hebben, helemaal niet. Want Wendy schreef een proefschrift met 4 kwalitatieve studies, gaande van literatuurstudie tot kwantitatieve en kwalitatieve empirische studies. En je slaagde erin die allemaal te publiceren in de hoogst gerankte journals. Ook het laatste artikel ondergaat laatste revisies en wordt binnenkort gepubliceerd. Het heeft allemaal te maken met jouw ondergrondelijk organisatietalent, schrijftalent, maar ook dat doorzettingsvermogen. Een doorzettingsvermogen die je hard nodig had tijdens COVID-19, want toen werd data verzamelen plots iets moeilijker, maar jij bleef jezelf, je bleef kalm en deed gewoon rustig verder. Na de pandemie was er gelukkig ook tijd voor wat meer reizen opnieuw en congressen. Denk aan Early SIG in Cadiz of de Early Congressen in Thessaloniki. Brengt ons alweer bij het dessert, Wendy. Want de weekends in 23 werden vooral klusweekends. Samen met hart en toeverlaat Wessel ging Wendy verbouwen. En niet zomaar een huis, maar wel het huis van de grootmoeder van Wessel. Wessel en Wendy gaven het warme nest een update en aan het begin van onze PhD-meetings maakten we ruim tijd om af en toe te praten over die renovaties of binnenhuisinrichting. En toen moest het beste nog komen, want ook weer tijdens dat PhD-traject van Wendy, nota bene, op 6 april 24, om heel precies te zijn, werden Wendy en Wessel de trotse ouders van Jeppe. En het was meteen duidelijk dat Jeppe, nu vandaag ook, net zoals zijn moeder er stevig voor gaat. Zo stevig dat hij zijn ouders graag wakker houdt 's nachts. Het komt de wallen onder de ogen misschien niet te goede, Wendy, maar je werk gaat er in ieder geval niet onder lijden. Ook daar blijf je jezelf. Je gaat gewoon lekker door. Dit brengt me tot slot bij het gezelschap rond de tafel. Want een goed gerecht, een sterrengerecht, eet je immers niet alleen. Onderweg kon Wendy rekenen op de niet aflatende steun van collega's in de zaal, vrienden en familie. En al te graag maakte Wendy in de weekends tijd voor vriendinnenweekends, ergens te landen, of een weekendje Groningen bij haar ouders Erik en Tina en opa en oma Nuis, die vandaag ook online volgen. Het is duidelijk dat je uit een warm nest komt, Wendy, en dat je daar de volle steun krijgt. Mama, papa, oma, opa, Wessel en Jeppe, ze mogen terecht heel fier zijn. Tot zover, beste publiek, het topmenu van een sterrenchef. Gelukkig zag ook de School of Business dat je een sterrenchef bent en hebben ze jou geworven als assistant professor. In die rol ga je je onderzoek naar mentoring verder uitdiepen en je gaat onder meer mentoring ook in het bedrijfsleven onderzoeken, misschien zelfs in vocational education, heb ik begrepen, want ook daar is mentoring broodnodig. Ik rond af, Wendy, met je nog heel veel lekkere topgerechten te wensen in de toekomst. Ik weet zeker dat er nog veel zullen volgen en ik hoop onze mooie samenwerking te kunnen verder zetten. Nog eens van harte proficiat met jouw uitstekende verdediging en aanstelling tot dokter. En nu allemaal is het tijd voor feest. Proost.
Dank je wel.
Dr. Nuis, ik geef graag het laatste woord aan iemand die hier niet lijfelijk aanwezig is, maar toch heel dicht en nauw betrokken is bij jouw proefschrift, bij het assessment ervan en bij de verdediging. Professor Dr. Eva Kind, het woord is aan jou.
Ja, dankjewel. Het is een hele eer om een van de eerste te zijn na je promotor, om je te feliciteren. Proficiat, Dr. Nuis. Ik ga het kort houden, want ik besef dat ik tussen het publiek en de receptie sta en dat is best wel gevaarlijk. Zeker nadat je promotor iedereen echt hongerig gemaakt heeft. Ja, heel veel complimenten voor je proefschrift, ook je verdediging. Ik denk, je stond er echt. En ik denk dat de Universiteit Maastricht een hele slimme zet gedaan heeft met jou een job te geven. Het is een plezier om met je samen te werken in de projecten buiten je doctoraat, want er zijn er nog meer mensen. En ik kijk ook naar uit om in de toekomst zeker en vast met jou ook eens een glaasje te toosten op deze verwezenlijking. Proficiat.
Dank je wel.
Dank je wel, professor Kind. Dear Dr. Nuis, let's switch back to English. The language of your preference, I understood. Also on behalf of Maastricht University and its community, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. I close this session. Ik vraag de geachte aanwezigen alvast op weg naar Lumière te gaan. Wij blijven nog heel even hier voor een fotosessie, Wendy. En dan zien we elkaar later vandaag. Dank u voor uw aanwezigheid. Dank u voor uw support. Tot ziens.